I'm here today with Tunde Wey, who's joining us live from New Orleans. I'm very grateful that you were able to join us for this call for our Terroir Talk. I'm Arlene Stein, the founder and director of Terroir Hospitality that's been running educational programs in food and food systems for some time. And so we're going to get started in our conversation with Tunde about his recent authorship and articles that he's been writing around some of the fundamentals that have to change within the context of restaurants, but also getting a little bit of background of his journey in food and where he went from chef to writer to activist and author. And so Tunde, again, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
I read in some articles about your journey to America. You're from Lagos in Nigeria, and
yeah, Lagos.
Your parents sent you to Detroit to live with your aunt back in 1998?
2000.
2000, okay. And so their hopes for you were that you were going to go to medical school, and somehow you ended up in this journey of food. Can you just tell us a little bit about what attracted you to food and why you sought that as a mechanism for expression?
So, I mean, the honest truth was that I stumbled into I stumbled into owning a restaurant in that I was able to, without much money, with only $4,000, find a space and open up a restaurant. So that's what I mean by I stumbled into it. I hadn't planned on opening up the restaurant or a restaurant 6 months before I did. And it just so happened that I had one. But I haven't finished college, and at the time I hadn't finished. I was planning on going. I wanted to apply to a school. I got admission into the school, but I couldn't afford to pay for the school, and they weren't offering scholarships to cover the entire tuition. And at the time, I was undocumented, and so I wasn't able to get any sort of grants or anything. And so when that fell through, I was like, "Fuck it! I'm just gonna say yes to every opportunity that comes." I met up with a friend. He was talking about opening up a restaurant just casually. And I was like, let's do it. And he wasn't serious, or he didn't think I was serious. I didn't know how serious I was. And then 6 months later, we had a restaurant in Detroit. And I stayed in restaurants because I felt like that people took me seriously in that space.
So that's interesting that you talk about people taking you seriously. So two things come to mind for me. One, lots of immigrants fall into food and hospitality as a mechanism purely for financial reasons, which sounds not unlike your journey. But my experience of restaurants is that typically people aren't taken seriously. So obviously you felt some kind of fulfillment in this realm. And so what was it that was feeding your nourishment in hospitality and restaurants and food?
We designed the restaurant, or the restaurant experience, from start to finish, my partner and I. And so that sort of creative process was interesting to me. The other part was I was making as much as I made writing, working 2 days a week, 2 days a week on tips. And so I worked Friday and Saturday, and I made as much money. I made about $1,600 a month. At the time, which was 2013, for me, that was amazing. In fact, if I could bring back those times right now, that would still be amazing. So yeah. So it was the income from the work, ownership, and creative control of the work up until the time that I didn't have it because my partner and I had differences. And the third thing was the attention that I got. In Detroit at the time, there was this sort of wave of smaller restaurants starting out, and there was attention around the scene, and we got some press. And so I said people sort of took me seriously because they took the restaurant seriously, and the restaurant was my idea. So I felt they were taking my ideas seriously.
It's curious that one of the things that lured you and kept you in the business was the financial incentive. It was one of the things that kept me in the business early days as well. we know that that's also a fallacy of the business. We're going to talk about that a little bit later. But I want to understand how you metamorphosize from cook to political activists in this realm.
Right. You know, if I could have messaged you before this, I would have asked you to remove the label, because I don't see myself as an activist, you know, for a couple of reasons. One is that the things that I'm saying are truth, and they exist. I know maybe for a lot of people they may exist on the margins, but for the people who they concern, they are firmly centered in their lives and experiences. And I think with all due respect to activists, some of the work that they do and the label that they have means that their work or the things that they work for are on the margin. So I want to make that distinction. And the other thing is, I actually know folks who are activists who are either who have devoted their time and their lives to work, and they work in place, and also folks um, who make a living being activists. And I don't have the same commitment to place yet. I mean, I have a commitment um, to Black folks, specifically, you know, people from Africa, but Black folks in general. And, you know, that's a more psychographic place. But I think there's a certain kind of seriousness and commitment that activists have that I don't think I have. And I don't have that. I don't want to hold the label. But how I got to this work was because, again, I sort of stumbled into it. Like actually, that's not true. I didn't stumble into it. As soon as I opened up my restaurant, I wanted to say something, you know. But what changed over time is what I was trying to say. At the beginning, I wanted to I wanted to say that the way you experience restaurants could be different. Like, I remember the first restaurant that I had, we used to play rap music all the time, which isn't a huge revolution. If you go to restaurants now, people play that kind of music. But it was 2013. We were serving a mostly white suburban crowd who were coming down to the city, and we're playing like Big and, you know, shit like that. And one woman, she called me over and she said, "You mind changing the music from this to what was played before, which was Miles Davis?" She said, "Because that music goes better with the food." And I just remember being offended because, you know, what jazz music is what rap music became. You know, that sort of anti-establishment music. I mean, and now rap music is super commercial. It's not as much revolution in the music. So my point is, I have always wanted to say something, but the things that I wanted to say just got finer and finer and finer as I got to know myself more.
Why do you think that food is such a useful tool for creating those conversations and that communication?
I don't know if it is any more useful than any other tool. It's just the one, like I said, that people take me seriously for. And so it's what I use. I think if I had stumbled into another thing, if I had become a landscape designer, or I think they're called, you know, people who like take care of lawns and shit. Maybe that's the same medium that I would have used to express myself. So I think, you know, food holds many unique particulars. You know, people come together, everybody eats, everybody eats communally, and we need to eat. And so there are all these like different parts of food that make it unique and peculiar. But I don't know if well, sorry, unique and universal. But I don't think food is the only forum to have conversations that could be transformative.
Well, I think it's interesting in your case because I believe that food can be used as a transformative way of changing or shifting people's mindsets. I think one of the interesting things that I think you work in is this racial disparity, which has become part of the conversation of your programs, but also is systemically one of the issues that we're going to deal with in terms of talking about what's wrong with the industry. I'm interested from your perspective. You were born and raised in Nigeria, but you've spent a good portion now of your adult life in America. What's the difference? What's the difference in societies? What are the strengths and weaknesses that you see? What were some of those contrasts that came to mind for you in terms of these two different worlds that you have inhabited?
That's a big question, but the simple answer is that, you know, Nigeria and Africa as a whole is a victim of colonial exploitation, and then neo-colonial exploitation as well. And so, if we're talking about material differences, you could just look at any index, any sort of index that measures quality of life, and the United States is on the fortunate end of the spectrum, and Nigeria and African countries are generally on the unfortunate end of the spectrum. So in terms of that, there's that. But then, I mean, culturally, you know, the differences, yeah, you know, we are as different and as similar as I guess we should be. The food is different, but we all eat food the same. The music is different, but we all like to dance and listen to music. The clothes are different, but we all sort of like fashion clothes in ways that make us feel good. So there are those similarities and there are those differences. But the differences that concern me are the difference that have a material impact on the outcome of folks, and that is caused by, you know, wholesale theft, historical and contemporary.
So a lot of your dinners and programs that you do aim to create a slight discomfort in the participant in order to challenge or incite dialogue around some of these issues. Again, going back to the platform of food, and I know that it could be music or it could be landscape, but what do you think food and dinners and convening people together, how they help facilitate these dialogues and sort of the awareness that they bring to the table?
Well, and excuse me if it sounded like I was discounting food as special. It is special. And one of the ways that it is special is that it creates a forum. You know, people actually come together to eat. People don't come together to mow their lawns. You know, that's a individual thing. So bringing people together to eat is sort of like where we set the table. And then at the table, you know, you can serve many more things, you know, including difficult conversations. And where food comes in again is that when things get difficult and uncomfortable, people can retreat back to their food. They can talk about the food, or they can put their food in the mouth and eat so that they don't talk. They can drink if they drink to feel more comfortable, or they can connect to the other person who has maybe a different perspective because they're all sharing the same meal. So I think food does that, but I don't want to overestimate the power of food. Like if you're having a disagreement with somebody that is important to you and that you hold your position strongly and the other person holds theirs just as strongly, there isn't any sort of food that can dissolve those differences. So I want to dispel that idea that food brings us together. Food brings us together to the extent that we can set a table to begin to have a conversation, but food doesn't have any sort of like magical ingredient in it that allows people to somehow fall in love and accept each other's differences, especially when these differences are, you know, crucial to the identities of these people. So I think food is special because it brings us together, but what happens when we are brought together at the table over food then becomes up to, the people at the table, the ideas in the ideas being contested, and also the power dynamics that exist, maybe not at the table, but outside of the dining space, that inform what happens at the table.
Can you tell us a little bit about these pop-ups that you did that were very specifically set up to showcase the social and the economic disparities amongst societies? So I'm talking mainly about your fried chicken one, where you gave people different prices and handed people empty boxes. Because I think that kind of experimentation really highlights for people in a surprising way.
Yeah.
That shock of our socioeconomic system.
It's actually confusing for me too to put it together. So the idea was how do we show the randomness of privilege, and then how do we show the disparity in privilege? So what we did was, I had a food truck and I was serving all kinds of things. Well, by all kinds of things, I was serving not chicken, but different kinds of food. But the customer only had three options of a to-go box, A, B, or C. When they made their purchase, they had no idea what was in the box, but they were consenting to pay for whatever came in the box. But before they paid, I told them, we talked about racial wealth disparity, and I sort of like laid it out to them. In fact, it was a conversation. So I didn't lay anything out. The customer sort of had their position. So if they were white, say, I asked them about privilege, and they sort of like talked about what privilege was like in America. And most of them came to the conclusion that white folks were the beneficiary of privilege at the expense of Black folks and people of color. And so when they had made this this declaration, I asked them how much they wanted to pay for their lunch, and I gave them three options. The first was the regular price. The second was was a price that reflected the racial wage disparity between white and Black folks, which is generally, I did that project in Detroit. I think it was 2.5 times. So the regular price was, say, $10. The racial wealth disparity price was, say, $20. And then there was a third price, which reflected the racial wealth disparity. So this is the difference in net worth between Black and white folks, which is 10 times. So the typical white household in the US, at least as of 2016, had about $171,000 net worth. The typical Black family was $17,000. And actually, if you disaggregate those numbers based on different cohorts, so if you look at Black women, that number begins to like trend towards zero and negative. So folks in the Black community, some groups have negative wealth. And actually, if you just look at that number, if you take out things like the value of your car vehicle, which is an asset, then we are just looking at, zero to negative wealth. Anyway, so $10, $20, and then $100, I think, for the meal. And some people paid $100. So you pay the money, and then if you're white, you go into this randomized pool of A, B, and C. And I didn't know what A, B, and C was. A would be, say, the options were a full meal, a bite-sized meal, and then an empty box. I didn't know beforehand which of the three boxes would be labeled A, B, or C, and obviously the customer didn't know. So they were just picking a random box, and I think a couple of people paid $150 or something, or $100, and felt good about that decision. And there was a fellow who actually bought 2 lunches for $150 or 100 each, and he chose like A and B, and they were both empty. And his face was it was interesting. But actually, the most interesting thing about that was how I felt. It just felt like really emotionally draining to give people empty boxes after they had paid $100 for each box. And so that experiment didn't last long because I'm like, I can't do this shit. I can't be taking people's money and not giving them food. Because like it's like, you know, if you're making food, you want to you want to feed people. You don't want to feed people empty boxes. So anyway, that was the project.
Well, it sounds like an incredibly inspiring experience, but also, as you said, challenging. But let's talk about feeding people and the role of the restaurant. So restaurants are an uncomfortable place. Restaurants have been an uncomfortable place for a long time. They've suffered from many fallacies in terms of the infrastructure that they were set up on. You talked about opening a restaurant with very little resources, which happens often. People are underpaid, suppliers are underpaid, people are overworked, they don't have a social safety net. There's a racial disparity amongst workers in restaurants. You wrote this piece at the beginning of the pandemic, Let It Die, exposing what was already flawed in our system. Has your position changed, or actually give us a little synopsis of what your thoughts were at the beginning of this pandemic and what they are now in terms of the state of the restaurant industry?
Well, my thoughts at the beginning of the pandemic were bigger than the restaurant industry. I think most of my thoughts are bigger than the industry. But again, it's the industry's the lens that I filter these thoughts through. And at the beginning, I was, you know, honestly, I was enraged. I was probably a product of just like my general state of anger, but also it was directed at the disparity in experiences. And there was all this language that was alarmist about the pandemic, as it should be, but then that language wasn't manifest in what I was seeing in the public. So I saw folks were still, I mean, even though folks were locked down, you know, folks were still like going out to the park and ordering food, watching television, like just living their lives in such a way as if, at least from, you know, from my perspective, as if it was just a weekend. This isn't an indictment on how people live. I don't expect people to live differently, but I just experienced the dissonance in the language, and also the expression of uncertainty around the pandemic, and then what I saw actually happening. And then my parents live in Nigeria. My parents and my siblings live there, and I have family and friends whose family and friends also live there. And just recognizing that the limitedness of American life during this pandemic is the status quo of life for a lot of people in Nigeria, on the continent. Like that is what life is. If you're living on $2 a day, your life is very small. I'm not talking about your internal spiritual life. I'm talking about your material life. Some people do have a robust interior lives despite the material constraints. So this dissonance is what like inspired the rage, and the rage is what inspired the writing, which I published on Instagram, but it's now published somewhere else. I just say that the future that we fear is already here. It's already here, happening in marginalized or frontline communities. It's happening in Africa, in Nigeria to be specific, and then you can even drill down further. It's also happening in communities of color here in the US, in Black and brown communities. As we can see, you know, with the pandemic, the folks who are most hit by the pandemic are, you know, Black folks, and folks of color, and the folks who are not just hit by or ravaged by the actual disease, but who have to be on the front line are also people of color too. The folks who are least protected, and the folks who are least folks who are least protected, and the folks who are most affected are folks of color. And so that was the so that was the first part of the piece, that there is no uncertainty if you apply like a really critical lens to the issue. And then secondly, this idea of bailing out restaurants will not do anything but reinstitute or reify the status quo. And if the status quo was one of disparity, disparity that always privileged white folks, white and affluent folks at the expense of Black, brown, and working class folks, then it's not a it's not a new future that I want to invest in. And so my recommendation was that instead of advocating for a sectoral bailout, which is what folks were doing, we should be looking at revamping the entire economic system to make people whole. And people include both the workers and the owners. So instead of investing in the ownership class and building the asset base that they have, which is restaurants, while we're also financing the consumption of working class people by giving out stimulus checks, which they pay back out in rent and food, that we should look at things like universal health care, some sort of basic income, some sort of guaranteed employment, quality housing, quality childcare, quality leisure, as the beginning of a new system that embraces and respects all people.
Talked about low wages. So some people don't realize, I read that Louisiana actually doesn't have a minimum wage, that they uphold the federal minimum wage, but for a tip worker, that can be as low as $213 US an hour. So I don't know what that looks like on unemployment, but in my world, it would look like about 50 cents.
Yeah.
Healthcare, which, you know, has been an ongoing debate since your last election. And then the extraordinarily expensive prices of education system, which you are well aware of. And so what's the reluctancy in the American psyche that won't allow a shift so that there's a better support system for people? So universal wages, you know, free education for people, free healthcare for people. What's the controversy, and why can't we get to that place? Because I agree, it's not about the restaurants necessarily. These are societal issues.
Yeah, well, I would say that the US, I mean, the US is different, but it's no different from how European countries treat Muslims and Africans, you know, migrants. It's no different. I this is my I think, but I would just say this, that I don't think this is an economic question, because I have and I'm reading um, credible thinkers who can make the economic case for universal healthcare, universal income, all of those things. There will be trade-offs, you know, and I think it's the trade-offs that people don't uh, want to accept, and those trade-offs mean that people will lose power. And so if you look at, say, France as an example, um, there is a notion of what it means to be French, and you have to like assimilate into that idea. But that idea is expensive, not for white French people, but for everybody else who doesn't fit the mold. But if you were to create a more egalitarian, um, ironic, right? A more egalitarian um, state, then what that would mean is that like white French people would lose something, you know? And similarly, in the United States, even though I don't think it's an economic reality and people have made it so, or an economic question and people have made it so, the truth is that if there was more equality and less hierarchy in status, I don't think that we can comprehend what that means. I don't think folks can comprehend what it means that somebody from a working class background and somebody from an affluent background have the same chances of getting into a really coveted school or job. Like it just like boggles the mind, you know. It boggles the capitalist mind. It boggles the mind of folks who are invested in this like global capitalist system. It also boggles my mind too. I'm not exempt from mind-boggling. I think that some people. I was talking to somebody, and I was talking about how I don't believe people should be poor, and she said, "Well, how is that possible? We need poor people, you know." And this is a Nigerian person. And I think a lot of us have these ideas that we need something at the bottom of us in some way. But the unfortunate thing is that this way is material. Like we need somebody or someone materially worse off than us, so that I don't know, I can't understand it. If you look at it in the US, the the case for immigration here, it's one that has this sort of um, weirdly negative context. It's like, let's get people to come in here so that they can fill jobs that Americans don't want. That's a huge thrust of the argument. And again, it's reinscribes this idea that we need people at the economic bottom and then people at the top. And I personally don't necessarily think that we shouldn't have hierarchies or disparities. I don't necessarily think, or haven't thought through this idea that everybody makes the same amount of money. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that people have access, that everybody has the same sort of access, and everybody lives or exists at this base that is dignified. And so that if you were a working class person, you didn't have to worry about paying your energy bill, and you didn't have to worry about living in unsafe housing. And so this consciousness shift that is necessary to make that happen, I think is a barrier in my mind to reform. Now people may talk about, now the actual policy questions that need to be answered to see that reform through. But I think the first step is changing our consciousness. But just one more thing about that. I don't believe that the first step needs to happen for people to have material, to have a better material well-being. Because if that was the case, we will be waiting too long. I think there are other ways to get there, and I hope my work sort of does some of that.
Issues, and you've highlighted it, is this idea of our societies being driven by capitalism. It's part of what drives restaurants as well. I think that that's something that needs a little bit of a shakedown, but it's also precipitated by the point of view that everyone in society wants to be able to achieve that kind of level of success, which is where you get the hierarchy. So it's kind of a vicious running circle. And so how, again, do we protect the people, especially with respect to restaurants? How do we bail out the restaurants that are actually going to want to change the model so that they provide a better ecosystem, a healthy ecosystem for restaurants to survive in, versus the big corporate chains that are just going to maintain that system? Because that's what I worry about, that the capitalist model will continue to thrive, and the restaurants that we want to survive, the businesses, forget restaurants, the businesses that are doing the right thing and supporting healthy communities will end up, those will be the ones that die.
I don't necessarily think that big business is a problem. I know that big business is almost exclusively problematic, like terribly so. But we make a distinction in our heads between, say, big business as in McDonald's and big business like Apple, or big business like Disney. So Disney is fine because Disney's making films and there's a park, but McDonald's is terrible because McDonald's is not encouraging, but is investing in commercial farming by, through its supply chain. I don't think that we can, like, McDonald's as a corporation can make different decisions. And I'm not making a case for McDonald's to exist. I'm just making the point that we need to think critically about what serves us, and not just like, not wholesale dismiss um, corporations or entities based on their size. My personal inclination is towards smaller modular solutions, but I don't think we should dismiss big business. I also don't know, like when people talk about capitalism, I think some of the people who I've heard speak about it conflate capitalism with technological advancement, with commerce and trade, and then even apart from those um, conflations, there's still like nuances in capitalism that I don't think people tease out. So I prefer to say like the current economic system that we have, call it whatever you want to call it. Like is China a capitalist system or not? Who knows? But the current economic system that we have is generally shared globally, except maybe your North Korea, but even North Korea has some sort of like capitalist bent to it. And I just think we must think about money differently. Money being the ultimate goal of the system, the acquisition of resources. We have to think about the acquisition and the distribution of resources differently. And when we do, we begin to value people and the product of their work differently. And going back to restaurants, the way we start that is currently there's this tremendous organizing potential coming from restaurants, but is being directed at these short-term benefits that only focus on the ownership. I would say that these folks abandon any attempts at sectoral lobbying and focus on a comprehensive plan to rescue the American person, to rescue individuals, to rescue the collective, not workers, not owners, because we all fall under the label of person. And so if this lobbying push was directed at comprehensive economic reform, then I think this is the beginning of how we change things. And again, there are different vehicles to do this. I think the most popular one is the Green New Deal. It has been around for a while, but has been picked up again by the progressive arm of the Democratic Party. I think these economic policies that rethink how wealth is redistributed, how society is served. This is what we need to figure out.
So Louisiana and New Orleans specifically is no stranger to crisis, huge devastating crisis. And I've read a lot about sort of your opinions on what we could have learned from Katrina to have made us better, to have made us more resilient. And I'd love you to just highlight, in one of your articles, it was the Let It Die, actually, you talk about Katrina wiping out most of the restaurant industry, and it went from 6,000 to 6 restaurants pretty much overnight. And so we obviously didn't shift enough. I'm worried actually that we won't shift enough in this crisis, even though we should be really awakening in this. What can we take away as lessons learned to actually improve ourselves for the future that you would suggest?
I think my solution, or what I suggest is consistent. Like we need government to look at making people whole through those, healthcare, housing, jobs, all that stuff. So that remains what I stand on. But Katrina as an example shows us the fallacy of our current thinking. which is, and the fallacy is that we can somehow, invest money into, a devastated industry or community without addressing the underlying inequalities that exist, and then expect on the other side of this investment, things would be more equal. That's just not possible. if you don't solve for X, like X is always going to be X. And so Katrina was the example, right? There was complete devastation to the city, but also to the restaurants. And then there was this wave of investment, federal investment, private investment. But what always happens is that investment, sort of tends towards whiteness, and also folks who already have the resources. And so 10 years or 15 years later, what you see is that New Orleans lost what I think is a significant portion of its Black, of its population of Black folks, and the sort of like measure of revenue capture that was used prior to Katrina did not change. So Black businesses, or the term uses minority businesses, capture 2% of receipts. And pre-Katrina, post-Katrina, that number did not change, despite all of the investments, despite the revenue to the city, increasing significantly, despite the building of infrastructure in the city. So I'm saying that despite all these new opportunities that were created, Black folks in the city were either doing just as bad or faring worse. And this is what is going to happen. I mean, this is definitely what's going to happen post the pandemic, because I know that we're not going to, by we, not me, but I mean, the government, and then the larger sort of like cultural and social reality isn't going to address the fundamental inequality that creates the disparities that we all say we despise, but somehow choose to do nothing about.
Chefs have an inherent power at this moment, and have for some time, in terms of advocacy. What do you think is the responsibility and the role now for them to, and what should they be advocating for, again, a healthy, resilient industry moving forward?
Well, the truth is, some chefs have a platform, not all chefs. I mean, most chefs don't. So we're talking about, David Chang, Tom Colicchio, these folks who have huge cultural reach because of their television shows and their product placements and all that stuff. And what I think, again, these chefs should be advocating, not for anything to do with the restaurant industry, but everything to do with people in general, everything to do with making those folks whole. And at the risk of like sounding like a broken record, universal healthcare, basic income, some sort of job guarantee, quality leisure, quality housing, quality childcare, quality education, as a suite of social services that everybody should have.
So that's a very strong message, and I'm glad that you do keep reiterating it. I'm going to be a bit provocative and just ask, because I'm curious, and I think you'd be honest. What did you think of a lot of the incentives to actually have some of these larger corporations raise money for their employees for the employee benefit?
The folks in the restaurant business who are crying foul are the same folks who have actively participated in this system that has been fouling people. And so this is the game, if you're able to, as a large corporation, as Ruth Chris or as Shake Shack, if you're able to like extract the most from the system in terms of grants and loans, then you fucking do that shit, because that's what the system expects you to do, right? I personally don't agree with it, but I think that, Ruth, Chris, or Shake Shack, if they didn't have the option, and they also didn't have, well, if they didn't have the option to these loans, they would let staff go, but sit on cash, right? Because these corporations have access, as we saw with Shake Shack, they have access to the debt markets. They have access to private capital markets. But they would sit on cash and fire people. Because that is what is expected. And that's what they have done. So I don't think it makes sense to cry foul, because this money is supposedly going to hiring the, the the workers who either have been laid off or would be laid off. I think what's interesting is the language of solidarity that all of these folks are using, solidarity with workers, when they're in fact looking out for themselves, looking out for their bottom line. And so I think Shake Shack and Ruth Chris and all these other folks should have taken the money, because that's the system that these folks were playing in. The reason why, from what I understand, the reason why the loans, or sorry, the reason why the categories of restaurants, in terms of size, were the way they were. So if you're considered a small business or small restaurant if you have 500 employees per location, or less than 500 per location. The reason why this was put in place was because you had folks like Shake Shack, or folks like Tom Colicchio's business that had multiple employees per location. But if you sort of like put the numbers together, we're talking about 2,000-3,000 employees, and they wouldn't have qualified. So they made this. So this concession was put in there, and then the concession came to bite them back in the ass, and now they're complaining. I don't buy it. Like, if you want to play with the big boys, then stay in the game. You can't like ask for help at the end. Like, stay in the game.
So you're talking about the PPE, which is the employee payment plan.
Yeah, payment protection plan. Something like that, I think.
Payment protection plan. And so is the idea, what I've understood is that it's actually not applicable to most people, because they can't hire the employees back in the timeline that they're allowed to access that loan. And further to that, it just becomes a loan on their business, which is further a debt on their business. So it doesn't make sense for them to actually access it. Is that the case?
I mean, I am not, you would have to talk to one of these people, but that's what they say is the case. But, you're talking about access to tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of dollars, maybe. That is never a problem. Like, so I would think if you own a business, and you have access to that kind of money, that's like a line of credit. So my point is that it may not be favorable, but it is still beneficial. So if you're able to, say, get 10 million from the government, but the stipulation is that you have to hire employees within 2 months, you hold the money in your account, and then if you make the assessment that you can't hire people within 2 months, then you give the money back. But if there is some sort of like cash flow situation, then you always have the benefit of the money. My point is, like, there are different like grades of terrible, and to have access to a lot of money and not be able to spend it in the way that you want to spend it isn't as terrible as not having a job. Which isn't to say that there isn't like a lot of psychological trauma or stress that comes with managing these like large responsibilities of employees, businesses, loans, and all that. Yeah, there is. But similarly, on the other side, or further along the spectrum, there's also stress with like not knowing where you're going to pay your rent, not knowing where you're going to get some money for food and utilities. We're all suffering. Some people are suffering with just much more money.
So Bringing it back to restaurants, and the reason why we're all in this business is partially because we do love the idea of hospitality. The South is revered for its hospitality. From your point of view, what kind of restaurants do you want to see survive this crisis in your region of the world? And what does it mean to be a restaurant in the future for you?
With all due respect to people who own restaurants, because I have some friends who do, I'm agnostic to the type of restaurant that survives. Um, I love going to restaurants. I love to eat, but I'm more concerned about what type of people can survive this emotionally, financially, and more. You know, so I'm not interested in the survival of the industry. You know, we don't like fundamentally we don't need restaurants in our lives. We don't. We need employment. Yes. I mean, we don't need employment, but we have been made to need employment in this monetary system. So employment, yes. Food, yes. A space to gather, yes. All of these things can happen outside of restaurants. So I don't think that we need restaurants, but we need people to be whole. We need people to make a fair wage. We need people to have access to quality healthcare, quality education, quality housing, quality leisure. We need higher and more equitable quality of life. That's what we need. Everything else is icing, is extra. We don't need any of this shit. You know, even the ownership in restaurants should also be given the choice of whether they want to continue to own a space that is, you know, financially and emotionally um, troublesome for them. You know, so if they were made whole too, I think the choices would look different. I'm sure in my idea of the world, if it were to come true, some restaurants would exist. Um, but I think more important than that, people would exist in such a way that they felt whole and dignified. And that to me is where the investment should be made.
You have a new documentary that just came out. You've posted on your Instagram. Tell us a little bit about that and how it's going to be laid out.
So myself and my production partner Theo, and also a friend Ruth, are working on this is the food show. We call it a food show, not about food, and it's basically about the consequences of production and consumption of food. And so we just like we the way I describe it is that there are all these different um, narratives that exist. Right. So if I ask you about New Orleans, for example, what's the first thing that comes to your mind?
Drinking, Mardi Gras, beads.
Right. And so we want to complicate like every narrative that we tackle. So people think of New Orleans and think of Mardi Gras, beads, drinking, which they should, and think about Black culture and all that stuff. But the narrative thread that we want to add to that is that New Orleans is Black people food, or the food of New Orleans is from Black folks, but Black folks don't get the credit. They don't get the credit in that they don't get the notoriety for creating the food. They don't get the compensation and the recognition. So that's the story that we want to tell. If you think of tech and food, right? We probably think of tech optimizing efficiency. Well, the story that we want to tell is that the efficiency of optimization comes at a cost to people. And what does that look like? So the show is about complicating narratives around food and not settling for the simple answer. And I think the show would rarely feature any food.
Tunde, I want to thank you for your time today. It's been very enlightening. I hope that you got something out of it. Really appreciate that you're able to have this conversation with me, and I look forward to speaking to you again in the future.
Me too. Thank you so much for your great questions.
Okay, thank you so much. Take care.
All right.